war crime because they were hearing of instances of rape happening in the field, got involved with Bassioni, and they went together and they began interviewing people. And he created a database. Well, actually, I think it was more like, files that this was a long time ago, no databases then, but he created all these files from interviews with people who were fleeing, refugees, and so forth. There were various camps where people were located. What have you experienced? Where were you living? What did you see? And he began putting together all this material. And then Boutros Ghali at the UN, then the Secretary General, heard about this and contacted him. And together they set up this idea of not just the ICTY, but the ICTR, the Rwandan and the Yugoslav tribunals. And they were set up as sister institutions with a single chief prosecutor. A lot of people don't know that. But then they became so large, each one, that one chief prosecutor couldn't run both of them, and so they set up separate organizations for both. And the residual mechanism I pointed to is also resolving the leftover bits and pieces of the Rwandan tribunal. Not everybody, there still are fugitives, I believe, outstanding from there. So the first trial, in 1993, they started, and mostly the translators they had on staff were field interpreters, because they were, as I said, going into the field, finding people, talking to them. Most of the field interpreters were kids who were taken out of college, out of universities, and the people said, come with us and we'll do this. They were good at English in their classes, and they went off. And it was a pretty traumatic business because the war was still ongoing until 1995 in Bosnia, and later in Serbia in 1999. So these kids, often just 21, 22, 23, were going into the field and interpreting testimony of people who had just seen their families murdered in front of them, or their homes burnt to the ground, or both, and were, I think, very traumatized by that. I knew some of those people. Then they began to have the first trial, and they realized what they needed was not only a cadre of professional booth interpreters, because these were tricky, complicated things that you couldn't just sort of do offhand, but they also needed people to translate documentary evidence, because almost all the evidence that was tendered in the courtroom in these trials were documents. I mean, they had witnesses who would come and say what they'd experienced, of course, but most of it was something somebody had signed saying, do this. And they were military documents largely. And they required all kinds of, come on in, wherever you can sit. There are, yes, there's chairs back there. And there's also another chair up here.
There's just plenty.
Yeah, there's more chairs. Make yourself comfortable. So this was the point in 1996 when CLSS, the Conference Language Services section, began creating their units of interpreters and translators to handle both the documents. Well, you saw 2.5 million pages of transcripts, but there were also more than 1 million pages of documents translated in the 20 years of the tribunal. And so they needed to create units. And I came in, as I said, in the summer of '98. So this hadn't been going on for very long, just a couple of years. And there was this, they began bringing in experienced translators and interpreters from the region. And this created all sorts of security issues, because everybody's got a grandmother somewhere. And even if your family is with you in The Hague, there's fear that somebody could be intimidated or frightened in your family, and then you might be persuaded to rely on what the translation unit was doing or whatever. And so there were these very strict security measures introduced. And also there was a clash between the field interpreters who'd experienced the absolute worst of everything and this new team of very experienced professional older translators and interpreters who were brought in and kind of, sort of, now we're going to make this work properly. And the field interpreters were hurt and insulted that their really devastating experience was that they were being dismissed somehow as unprofessional. And it was an issue because where I was working in the documentary section, we had to have consistency in documents, because the judges were getting hundreds, thousands, even many thousands of pages of documents per trial. And as you may know, in Slavic languages, there's all those endings. And so a place might be spelled in many different, if the person reading the text isn't being careful, especially if it's a plural name in the place name, then suddenly each time it's spelled a little differently in the English text because they're not paying attention to making it consistent and that kind of thing. So the judges were saying, is this all the same place, or are these different places? And they got so confused. So we realized we had to have a style guide. We had to have understand a set of shared rules about how to approach documents. And anyway, that was kind of a rough patch in terms of integrating all those different levels of experience. And also one issue that, of course, the war was the most vicious and savage in Bosnia, but there were the fewest professional translators in Bosnia because Belgrade was the political capital of Yugoslavia and Zagreb was the second largest city in the Bosnian, Croatian, Serbian region. And they were sort of a businessy sort of cap. So there were interpreters and translators in cities, but Sarajevo had not been involved at that level of activity very much. And so it was really important to bring in translators and interpreters from Bosnia, but it was not, they had to be trained, and it took a little while to, and there were lots of tense issues about that within the translation unit and other people, and all kinds of issues about which language. I can get into that later if there's interest for Bosnian, Croatian, and Serbian in the courtroom with the interpreters. That was a whole other set of issues. So then, as you can see here, 150 interpreters and translators, roughly half and half, were working in the peak years when I was there between 2005 and 2010, and they were about 10% of the tribunal staff. And that was true all along, always 10%. It was interesting. I went and checked through to see if that held true, and it did. And the interpreters and translators were working with, you have the English translation unit, the French translation unit, the interpreting unit were the different parts of the language services. And early on, it was decided that they wouldn't, even though there were, English and French were the working languages of the tribunal, and of course they had to deal with Bosnian, Croatian, Serbian, and whatever else turned up in the form of witnesses or the accused and so forth. But English and French, there were judges, there were staff who were Francophone and Anglophone at the tribunal, and it was designed to function for both. The Rwandan tribunal did a great deal more French than English. We did more English than French, but the fact of the matter was that the judges agreed early on that there was such a mass of documentary evidence in these trials, at the ICTY at least, that they wouldn't require that all the documents be translated into both English and French, because it was just simply a lot of money for $1 million of translation to be doing that into both languages. So they agreed they'd be translated into English, and then the Francophone and Anglophone judges would both use them, and the Francophone judges agreed that they were able to follow. And of course, everybody in the courtroom was wearing earphones, and they could hear all the proceedings going on in French, all the proceedings going on in English, whatever language anybody was speaking at any moment. There was like an English stream and a French stream, and a stream for the whatever language the person was using who was testifying. And there were stenographers or court reporters, I think is what they call them in a courtroom situation, who were maintaining a transcript real time. In the English typist was in the room, the court reporter in the courtroom, and the French court reporter was outside of the courtroom, and they were both in real time translating what was happening, not translating, typing down what was happening on whichever stream they were listening to. And this was appearing on the screens really seconds after the person had said what they had said. So you'd see and I had colleagues who are experts in the region, historians and so forth, who would wait to see how it was translated, and then the judges would get angry, not translated, but how it was coming up on the transcript, and whether the court reporter had caught everything that they'd said or the names or whatever, and then the judges would get irritated with them and say, come on, you're not going to read what's on your screen. But it was always, the transcript was appearing, running along the bottom of the screen, the English transcript. And so you have the English and the French transcripts for all these trials are available on the website for all 10,800 sessions of the court. A few of them were confidential and kept closed, but mostly not. So one of the big issues that we dealt with as we came on board was vocabulary, as you can well imagine. Most of us, I'm a literary translator. I generally don't do military documents. There were some good resources. There was a military encyclopedia and a lexicon, a very good, well-written lexicon. And once you get into military language, that it requires a great deal of precision. And the reason it requires precision is because it's going out to a lot of people, these orders, and they want to make sure that everybody understands what's in the order. So there's all these code words and things that would come up and phrases and so forth, and we had to establish how to translate them consistently so that in the courtroom they could know what was being discussed. So we created a database of internal database, which is still not available for the public. I have a copy, but it's not. And there are 12,000 entries for different terms, plus these were the real killers, these abbreviations. We just had, I think it was 8,000 abbreviations that we had to figure out what they were. Now, sometimes it was reasonably easy to figure out, like the Nikola Shubitsky Brigade Missions. That doesn't require too much ingenuity, but there were ones that were much trickier. And if you just have a look here, you've got Beba is a homemade explosive. I mean, you might not know if you came up on Beba in a text that it referred to a homemade explosive. So the White Eagles. And then there's commentary, which is where the person found this term or how we know that's how it's translated. And this is pages and pages and pages of these things for like Pastragat could be a dog, a searching dog or something, but it was a cadaver dog. These were the sorts of things that we had to get clear, or even just Slikom na Sliko was a television program in Zagreb. We had to decide how we were going to talk about it. It was an interview program, and we had to make sure it was always referred to the same way so the translators could refer to these things. And when I was working there, part of the time that I was there, I was responsible for entering new terms into the system. And so, and there were often abbreviations that completely stumped us, and then we'd get a call from the booth, and an interpreter in the courtroom would say, I know you've been trying to figure this out, but someone just explained what it means. I'd whisper, it means this, and we'd write it in really quick so that we actually had it for everyone. They'd know what these things meant. And so that was hugely important, and it helped all the translators across skill levels and experience and so forth be literally on the same page with the terminology, which was very important. So in terms of, as Joanna said, shaping what went on in the courtroom, there were many ways that translation shaped what went on in the courtroom. It was something people talked about every day. And one of the things to keep in mind is that in the courtroom, you had the judges sitting in the front, 3 judges. You had the witness across from them sitting, testifying to them. And on the right-hand side was the prosecution with whatever staff they had, several lawyers and clerks or whatever. And on the left-hand side was the defense. And the defense, like with Milosevic or Karadzic, these people who had supposedly allegedly committed these crimes with their attorneys. And so the attorneys for the defense didn't really want to focus on their client, because everybody sort of had a pretty clear idea of what most of these people had done, and they wanted to distract attention from them. So what was the easiest thing for them to complain about? The language, the translation. And the defense attorneys were almost always from the region. At least one of them was. Usually there's a team of 2 or 3 defense attorneys, and one of them would be from the region. So they knew the language. And on the screen, in front of everybody in that courtroom, there were screens. And on the left-hand side, when there was a document under discussion, was the original, and on the right-hand side, the translation. So people, they would be poring over these documents and going, oh, this is a terrible mistranslation, this is outrageous, and so forth. So it became this constant. There isn't a single one of those 10,000 800 sessions where there wasn't some discussion about contending, something about translation or whatever. So one of the ways that translation came up is that witnesses would speak very quickly. And they were emotional. I mean, it was a very emotional thing talking about these crimes. They were horrible things were happening. So here's Mr. McCloskey, who's an attorney, and he's interviewing, examining a client, a witness, and he's not getting everything. No, he's not. He's listening to a discussion between, and often the defense attorney and the witness both spoke Bosnian, Croatian, or Serbian, but everybody else in the courtroom didn't, and so they'd start going very fast back and forth. And he says, if we could slow it down, I'd appreciate it. And Judge Rodriguez said, you can't hear the interpreters, but they do exist. Let me assure you, they're like God. They're there, but we don't see them. And there was this whole sort of aura of the translators and interpreters that was very interesting. And it's not to be missed that the interpreters in the booth were P4. Does anybody have familiarity with UN salary grades? So P4 is the highest level of professional before you're actually running a whole unit, before you're director of a unit. So it's a very high, and the attorneys, except for the senior trial attorneys, were all P4. So our interpreters in the courtroom were at the same pay grade as the attorneys who were prosecuting the cases. And that's important. There was a lot of respect for translators and interpreters at the tribunal. I was very impressed by that. Not invisible. And here are more examples. I just got amused by this. And I think it's important in terms of this business of how translators shape the trials, aside from this question of that's a mistake and we have to discuss it or whatever. This slowdown issue became a kind of comedy routine that went on between the judges and the attorneys. You're being asked to slow down, and then Mr. Morrissey says, Mr. Morrissey will now slow down. Or Judge Ori says, Mr. Russo, if you take a breath now and then, the interpreters can do the same. Or Judge Ori, if I give a sign to calm down, if you start apologizing, they have to translate that too. Which, of course, nobody was thinking about. And then, thank you, Your Honor, I too will try to be quick but slow-paced for the translators in the booth. Or, I'm sorry, I'll go slowly for the stenographer who's giving me dirty looks. There was all this back and forth that always went on, and it kind of lightened what was, as you might well imagine, not a particularly light atmosphere, and gave it sort of a little bit of lubrication for the discussion to go forward, to have the translators as kind, not exactly the butt of jokes, but kind of a civilian presence, maybe in the context of this otherwise very legal hearing. But there were also this issue of the self-represented accused. There were, I think, 6 of them out of those 161 who were indicted, and there were 90 who were convicted. But self-represented accused were people who said, I don't need an attorney, I'm going to represent myself. And of course, that's a right that anybody has. And in most cases, that was okay. I mean, with Karadzic and Milosevic, their English was good enough that they could be considered proficient in English, that they could run their trial in English. And they had a staff who worked on those things. But there was a man named Vojislav Šešelj, that's him being quoted here, who was particularly pugnacious, famous for being pugnacious, and just out to cause trouble. And he turned himself in, and I think it was 2003, and he saw that there was an indictment for him. And then he said, I am coming to the tribunal in order to destroy it. That's why I want to come. I want to show what a sham this institution is. And so he arrived, and he quickly realized that the translation unit was the Achilles heel of the tribunal, because if you clogged them up with a lot of work, they couldn't function, and then nothing could function, because you had to have the documentary evidence in place in order to adjudicate. So he said, I don't speak English. I can't run my trial in English. I have to submit everything that goes for my trial, all the administrative work, in Bosnian, or well, Serbian in his case, and then you just have to translate it all. And I have 80 books, by the way, that I've written. He's a very prolific fellow, and I think all those 80 books should be translated for the judges so that they can understand my position. And the court said back to him, no, we're not going to translate all 80 of your books. You have a fund that you have for running your trial that you've been allotted in the budget, and you can hire people in Belgrade to translate your books if you want, but we're not going to spend our time doing that here. And so then he went about insulting the interpreters and translators, and there was a famous moment where right before his trial began, there's a moment where the prosecution prepares a document explaining their strategy for the trial and what they're going to cover, any theoretical or historical precedents that they're relying on for building their trial. And it's footnoted with all these precedents and so forth. And so he said, well, this is outrageous. I can't read those footnotes of other, so I want you to translate not only this whatever 200-page document by the prosecution, but I want all of the reference material translated too, so that I can read all these trials they're referring to in Serbian and understand what they're about. And he said, can also decide that I receive all documents in Chinese language. I fully commiserate with the suffering of the registry, that's the administration. In terms of translation, if they had 30 translators, let them employ 300. It's not really my problem. And he really was pushing against the limits of what the tribunal could handle as an institution, being as that it was so dependent on translation to function. And he would hand in handwritten Cyrillic things. He said he wouldn't use a typewriter because he might be, or a computer because he might be electrocuted. And then he said he wouldn't stand when the judges came into the courtroom because he was offended by the rituals or whatever. So they worked that out, that he was only brought into the courtroom after the judges entered and sat. And then he said he couldn't have Judge Shum be the head judge of his trial because he was German, and he still was carrying the trauma of World War II. They just went on, and he was just trying to obstruct, he was kind of a buffoon, but also very, very destructive throughout the tribunal. And he was always saying things like, the interpreters working here are people with very limited general knowledge and they can't understand many things. He tried to insult them as much as he possibly could in the booth and in documents. So I found many, many examples of this obfuscation and this use of translation that he was employing in order to obstruct with a certain amount of effectiveness. And then we had Karadzic, who was one of the presidents of the Serbian part of Bosnia. And he, knowing English quite well, he was defending himself, and that meant that he was involved in every minute of the courtroom activities, as was Šešelj, who I described before, because he examined every witness. He was there instead of the attorney, so he would ask every witness questions. And then he would listen to the interpretation from the booth, and then he would contend what he thought were incorrect interpretations. So here's an example. There are many examples. So in this document that he has in front of him, here he is, the defense attorney and the defendant. And here you have a man from Serbia, in fact, someone who was brought out of the tribunal jail to testify. He was one of the indictees as well. So the both of them speak Serbian. But he's listening to the English. And the interpretation in that brackets means that he was speaking in Serbian, and what we see here is the interpretation of his remarks as the booth interpreted them. So he says, may I just suggest the following. Popovic says, užas. Now, užas is a Russian word, it means horrible. Užas in Croatian means horror. But when you say užas in Croatian or in Bosnian or in Serbian, what you're saying is, oh, God, that's just awful. It's a colloquial usage of the term. So the interpreter said horrible, it was horrible, užas, to užas. And he says horror would be a better translation, because it is, in fact, an accurate translation of the word užas, but not in its colloquial usage. So Judge Kwan, a brilliant judge from Korea at the tribunal, said, you have to ask the language services to take a look at this with a memorandum. You have to send a memorandum. That's the way it works. If you have a complaint about a language issue, send it to the language services, and they will respond with justification or explanation of why they chose to do that, or they will make a correction. Could you read the passage, Mr. Karadzic? Because the idea was read the passage and have the booth interpret it. So he says, yes, Excellency. It's the first line in the Serbian version. Horror, there was horror, or it was horrible, he says. I would like, because this is what the booth translated it as, and he was angry. He wanted the booth to say it was horror, it was horror, there was horror. That's right, that's what he was preferring. But then he was saying, or it was horrible, or no, the booth was, that's right, that's the blue is the booth and the red is him, sorry. So it was horrible is what the booth was interjecting after what he said. They translated it as he wanted it translated, but they corrected it afterwards. And he said, I would like to ask the interpreters to do a verbatim translation of this because he was angry that they were coming in after him and correcting him. And then the judge said, no, why don't you just read slowly so they can interpret? So he did. Yes, yes, here it is. Popovich says, horror, there was horror. And the interpreter says, or it was horrible, interpreter's note. So there was this constant battle going on between Karadzic and the interpreters of him trying to correct them. And the only reason he was doing it, really, because this is such a moot point, it makes no difference to the validity of the document in question. It is just a little thing that he picked up and needled with, and he wants to establish himself as an authority, that he is better and better informed than the interpreters, and that he get to give himself some power and authority over what's going on in the courtroom. Everybody can see what this is, horror, he says, and he was furious. And this comes up over and over again in his trial, these little correction things that he was constantly trying to impose. And the booth got very familiar with this strategy, and they would always be poised to deal with it as best as they could. So I had the enormous honor of being able to survey my colleagues. I had the plan to write this book. They approved of it. The boss of the language services said it was okay as long as I showed it to her. And then I put together a survey because I had a very small segment of knowledge about what went on at the tribunal. My job there was that I was what was known as a reviser, or it's a little bit hard to, none of the words quite fit what we were doing, but the things that the documents that we were working on were going into the courtroom as evidence. And our job was, there were many judgment calls. As you know, translating is all about choices that you make in judgment calls. And there were many judgment calls in every document, sometimes ambiguities that we had to figure out how to convey as ambiguities in the translation. We couldn't leave them and decide on one or another of the meanings. We had to have all the meanings there so that the courtroom could then look at that phrase or whatever and figure out what to do with it. It wasn't up to us to do that. So I knew that piece of it, but there were people in the booth, there were field interpreters, there were people doing other kinds of translation from other languages, from the French, from people working with Albanian. There were several trials that used Albanian into Albanian, from Albanian, people working into Bosnian, Croatian, and Serbian who were translating the judgments and the other court documents that the tribunal produced so that people in the region could read these things and learn from them and so forth. And so there were all these different perspectives, and I was very eager to get as many of them as I could because I didn't want to write a memoir. I wanted to give a broad survey of what that kind of work was like. So I had this wonderful opportunity to write a survey, and of the, I think I contacted 160 people whose emails I had, current and past staff members, and about 60 of them responded, which is a pretty good response level. And so I asked questions like, what was the most rewarding, what was the most upsetting, or whatever of the work that you did. And these were some of the things that people said. Seeing the guilty convicted, helping witnesses make their voice heard, that virtually no translations were questioned in the 4 years I worked as a reviser. This was a colleague of mine who just died 2 weeks ago, talking about thousands of documents. I mean, they were anonymous, the comments, but I didn't know some of them who they were. I mean, there were only 5 revisers, so we knew each other well. Working with some of the best and most experienced, and the salary, of course. It was a very good salary, especially for people coming from the Balkans. Translators were getting anywhere between $60,000 and $80,000 a year, and of course they had to live in Holland, which was not cheap, but nonetheless, most of the translators from the region I knew were supporting several families and buying apartments. Their siblings and parents and all sorts of things with that money. So it made a huge difference to them. So in the makeup and of the of our unit, Bosnian, Croatian, Serbian into English, which is where I worked, there were 35 translators. There was another probably 20 or 25 who were given outsourced work if it wasn't confidential, that they could translate non-confidential, in the documents that didn't have security problems. And then there were 5 revisers. Most of those people working into English were not native speakers of English. Most of them were from the region. They were experienced translators or were gaining experience as they went, but they were not native speakers of English. So there was, at the beginning, we had work to do with them on things like articles and the basic stuff of English, but that very quickly went away because we would get their translation on paper and the original on paper in our office. Then we'd go through it like this. And with pencil, we'd write in our suggestions or our changes or whatever. And then we'd send it back and they would enter the changes. So this meant that people learned very quickly. And so by the time I left in 2010, it was just much less that we needed to input into their translations than we had had at the beginning. And we did bring in some graduate students from the UK who had just finished a course of study in Norwich. No, I forget. Anyway, somewhere in the UK, and they came just out of graduate school, and they were English, but they didn't, and they knew the language quite well, but they didn't have a lifetime of experience of dealing with that part of the world because they were quite young still. But we trained them, and one of them ended up being head of the unit later. So most challenging, dealing with the possibly deliberate ambiguity in some source documents. That's just what I mentioned now. I had to change my interpretation style after 15 years of freelance work because everything said in the courtroom had to be interpreted for the record. Now, this was a huge issue. So the interpreter, as I said, you had the court reporters taking, it was all being recorded and filmed, and all that was also happening, but they were recording the English language and the French language streams. Afterwards, in later trials that dealt with the same regions and crimes, those transcripts could be used as evidence. So that meant that the interpreters in the booth had this enormous burden of creating interpretation that could serve as evidence. And it was something that they struggled with. Dealing, of course, with the subject matter of the translations, maintaining a neutral and professional tone when interpreting victim witnesses and faithfully interpreting under stress. So those are not surprising issues that people dealt with. I'm sure you could imagine in that situation that you would be dealing with many of those same things. People often ask me, so how did you deal with it? What was it like dealing with that kind of material? And of course, it was very disturbing. But there is a counter argument that I can always give, which is, first of all, the war was very disturbing. I had family there. I lost family there during the war in various ways. And our life was very deeply impacted by what happened. And I could do nothing until I got called to the tribunal, and then I could do something. I could use my skills and my knowledge to provide clarity for things that had happened. And even though it was disturbing, I was relieved. Instantly, I was relieved. Now, that is not to say that there weren't horrible days dealing with awful things. I remember one awful summer day when it was hot, which doesn't happen in Holland very often, and I wasn't feeling very well. I had kind of a headache or something, and I was translating all day about this kind of recreational killing, which is when people are high on drugs and they're doing stuff, and it's horrible stuff to, and I wasn't translating, I was revising someone else's translation, a witness who was saying that, who was horrified by seeing this happen, and his horror sort of seeped into me, and I was feeling miserable. And then somebody said, let's go to the movies. And I said, okay. And so we went to see Titus, which is a film with Anthony Hopkins based on the Shakespeare play about people massacring each other and cutting each other up and eating the children of this pagan queen. and the princes devouring them. I mean, it was, and I came home and I was just shattered. It was just a horrible moment. So there are lots of things like that. It's not that there weren't. But I was also sitting in an office with 5 language experts, and I'm a language person, and we talked about language every day, and I loved that. It's embarrassing to admit, but I mean, I really did enjoy working with the challenges of translation, and we would be working quietly each on our document in a room sort of this long with several tables in it, and a table on the side with, you know, the most urgent in one tray, and then less and less urgent, the various things, all different trials, not any one trial, but just whatever they needed at that moment. And then someone would say, has anybody seen this yet? And they'd say they were dealing with, and then we'd say, oh, yesterday I had that, and the translator did this with it, and I thought it was okay. Oh, okay, I'll say that's okay. And there was this whole little interchange that went on constantly, and I thought it was a very powerful experience for me, living in translation like that with other people. When we translate, so often we're in isolation. So I found that very rewarding. Now, how am I doing for time? Am I way over my time limit, or I don't have a watch?
No, it's good. I turned off my phone.
Oh, it's 10:50. So we're at 11. We're done. Is that the idea?
We have the room for a while. So
Well, I don't want
I
to.
don't want
I mean, there are lots of things I could say about the tribunal. Obviously, it was a rich experience, but I would rather say things in response to things that you'd be interested in. So, do you have questions, comments, things you'd like to include? Yes, please.
Yeah, I just want to comment on, like that attorney's accusing. I guess this could be a universal thing because it happens also where I come from. I used to work in a court, and the most thing like for indictments, like when someone knows they're going to be indicted, like that's the most like trick they play. So I was always also accused of being like, not translating well, or so
Well, then
yeah,
you know.
so it's a common thing, I guess.
Well, Karadzic made a complaint towards the end of his trial that it was outrageous and that he needed a retrial because with new translators and everything. And so the tribunal brought in an outside body to provide a sort of quality of work audit of the interpreting group. And they came away saying that it was over 90% accuracy, which is very, very high for interpreting. I mean, usually interpreting assumes a kind of 75% accuracy. So then they said, I'm sorry, but that doesn't hold water. We're not going to.
So I think sometimes like if the attorney accuses the translator of not translating well, when the attorney doesn't speak the language. So, and that happened a lot. And
Really?
say, yeah, and the judge, how do you know? How do you know? And it's like language is Pashto, Hindi, or something like that. And the attorney is a native Arabic speaker, and they say like, how do you know he doesn't know? Like he didn't translate it. Yeah, they just, remain quiet. I mean, they have nothing to say.
Well, one of the things that was interesting about the structure of the tribunal, unlike Nuremberg and the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal after World War II, was that in those two cases, Nuremberg and Tokyo, it was the prosecution who set up the translation service. So the interpreters and translators were working for the prosecution. And that was really different than what they did at the ICTY and ICTR, where it was the administration who set up the translation service, and we worked for everybody. And it's also true that the defense and the prosecution had their own teams of their own translators who were mostly combing through documents to say this would be a useful piece of evidence, because most of the people especially the prosecution, didn't know the language, so they couldn't assess whether something was valuable or not. And so you had these people going over, and they had their own, they'd ask for a kind of informative translation of something just to get a handle of it. And we had this kind of chaotic slightly situation towards the end of the tribunal when those informative translations made by prosecution translators were coming into the courtroom because there wasn't time to get them retranslated by my unit, and which was sort of that was the procedure, that it was, once it was or said that it was a valuable document, it was supposed to be retranslated by the official language service. And then that broke down because there was just too much. But some of these trials had 10, 15,000 pages of documents tendered for the one trial as documentary evidence, which the judges would have to go through. And there was just a lot of documents. And so then they developed a strategy, a procedure that if a prosecution translated document came into the courtroom, it was always announced as such. And if there was a disagreement about the value, the quality of the translation, it would then go to the translation unit for retranslation, but otherwise it would be accepted as such and they could move on. So they worked around it that way. But what that meant was that the judges could consult with us because we weren't representing either party. And so they would call us on the phone and my phone would ring and they'd say, what about this po here? Which is a very tricky preposition. And, there's po szkoła around it, among schools or through schools. And what does this mean? What does this mean? Something, atrocities were being perpetrated in school gymnasiums where they kept people. And they were sort of, what is this po? And so we would have these discussions with them about prepositions. And they were from all different languages themselves, from all over the world. So there was a certain understanding of the vagaries of language and the issues that might come up. But this issue that we could speak directly with the judges was a very interesting one for me.
How did you deal with the trauma? You spoke about traumatic experience.
Well, I asked my colleagues to address that, but I didn't say, how did you deal with the trauma? Because they would have just said, oh, I drank and used drugs. I had, but I said, what would you tell somebody who was considering this kind of work? What would you recommend to them? And I'm not sure if I included that here. Oh yeah, here we have it, the last. So they should take the job only with full support of a family. Make sure you can stomach a lot of awful things, and you have to distance yourself as much as possible from the human suffering involved. And I learned something about trauma that I'm sure people who work in police stations and emergency rooms know, and the military know very well. But it was my first experience with a job that had a lot of trauma involved. And that is that a lot of the people whose documents we were translating, the testimony and descriptions and meetings and stuff, were not people I personally identified with. I sympathized with them enormously and I was upset for them, but it wasn't as if it was happening to me. Often the atrocities took place in villages and little tiny places in the countryside where people led lives that were really different from my life. And so even though I felt for them, I didn't take it personally, if you understand what I mean. But then sometimes something would trigger, like one of the people had my birthday, or the birthday of one of my family members, or they lived on a street that had the same name as the street I lived on in Zagreb, or these random things that would just appear in a text, and suddenly it was happening to me. What I was reading was happening to me.
Did you cry at that time?
Sometimes, but mostly you just, you'd get up and walk around, or we had a stricture because of confidentiality issues that we couldn't talk about the things that we were dealing with in the text. But we could talk with the translator because I was revising translations that had been done by my colleagues. So if there was something really awful, I'd go over to them and say, oh, I did your text, you did a great job, and what a painful text. And we'd sort of sit there and commiserate for a minute about how awful it was, and that helped. At one point, and I even mentioned this in the book, we were sitting in the revisor room, 5 of us, and I said, what have you found to be the most traumatic for each of the people? This was early on when I was starting out, and one of them said these texts where someone comes to the door and says, you have to leave your home, and a person grabs a few things, puts them in a plastic bag, and they're out the door. That's so devastating to think of. Then another person said, trying to remember, that the names, getting the names right. Someone will come looking to find these names in the archive of the tribunal 30 years from now, and we want to spell their names right. And there were lists and lists and lists of names of bodies who were found, people who were missing, all this kind of thing, and we worked very hard on that. For me, it was, for some reason, I'd get to the point where I'd be walking down the hall and the floor would feel like it was doing this. I don't know if any of you have ever experienced this, but I'd had like spatial hallucinations based on the experience, of translating the minutes from meetings early in the war, because I lived there until 1990, and I was very familiar with all the points of view people had and the way they approached things. And when you saw these meetings early in the war, many of them, while all ethnic groups were still in the same room, but they were all threatening each other in very subtle ways, like, I know where you live kinds of things that people were saying to each other, and it just would make me sick to my stomach, this knowing what happened next. It was very hard for me dealing with those meetings and seeing, and the meetings were being attended in Republika Srpska in particular by the teachers, the doctors, the priests, all the people that you think of as the people who will regulate a community and keep it safe. And the people within education whose job it is to make sure that people are safe. And they're the ones leading the charge, and I found that very, very upsetting. It's not what I would have expected. I didn't know this but we had many of these meetings. And at the tribunal, they'd be picked up in various places. It's a whole thing in the book about where documents were found that were used as evidence. And the tribunal, that's not me. Okay, it sounds like my phone. Bosnia was a protectorate. It was not a sovereign country. As a result, it was possible for our investigators to walk into police stations and take evidence. And they'd get a letter from a judge at the tribunal saying, this person has the right to come in here and take it. And they'd walk up to file cabinets, and they knew what they were looking for, and they'd just start pulling documents out. They couldn't do that in Croatia and Serbia because those were sovereign countries, and they couldn't walk in without special permits. I mean, they had to, I don't know. But documents would arrive in the mail. Sometimes they got 5 copies of the minutes of a meeting that somebody felt was really important, and things would just arrive. And especially if they already had copies of that same set of minutes, they'd know that it wasn't counterfeited. There was a lot of concern about people finding old typewriters and creating documents like this if they were in the middle of the battlefield writing this document. There was a lot of worry about that. But if you got from different sources, that gave it a certain amount of credibility. And that's why the witnesses would be coming to testify documents. It was either someone had signed a document or had been in the room when it was signed, or was a forensic expert who understood about those kinds of documents. Those were the witnesses for most of these trials, dealing always with documents, aside from the initial testimony of witnesses at the beginning. Yes?
There are some people online who have questions, right?
Oh, I don't see those.
Yes.
Okay.
Do you hear us?
Now, how do I need help with this. I don't know what to do with it.
You cannot.
Okay, you perhaps you can just read the question.
Can you have your hands up? Do you want to say something?
I don't know how. I don't want to touch this computer. So if there's something you can do, then I'd be happy to.
Hello. You hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I just have a quick question. How are interpreters being recruited? Is there like some sort of testing or something like that?
How were they hired for that kind of work?
Yes.
Yes, there was testing. There were because there were interpreters and translators, there were different tests for interpreters and for translators. And when I came on board, they were really looking for interpreters, and people who had come in as translators would get trained in a dummy booth or whatever you'd call it, a blind booth. I'm not sure what the term is professionally, but they'd practice in the courtroom next to the person who was actually interpreting in another booth, and they'd be working to sort of get to the point that they could function. And there was this exercise I remember that I thought was very impressive, where they had to be interpreting what they were interpreting while counting down from 500 to 1. To train their brain to work in two channels at the same time. But that was internal training that went on. There was a lot of that. But otherwise, yes, people were tested.
Thank you.
Sure.
The next question, Susie.
Hi. Thank you for the opportunity. I have a question. I was just wondering if is there any some kind of research or investigation on how these interpreters really affect the outcome of the tribunal in a way that is probably not really accurate? you know, like because of this trauma, and also with speed of the speakers or the witness. So
Well,
that,
that's a very good question. If I may, that's a very good question, and one that when I started this project, was pulling together examples like the ones that I showed during the talk, and I thought those examples were compelling, and I didn't realize what it was that I was actually asking until I'd already put the whole thing together, and the book is organized where the first chapter, I forget, it goes chapter by chapter where I talk about the perspective of the administration and what it's like to be an interpreter, where I show the survey results, and then the prosecution, the defense, and then the judges. And it turned out that what I wanted to know, and when I started doing the judges chapter about the judgments and so forth, was exactly your question. Were there trials that were decided based on translation issues? Did they shape a trial so dramatically that there was an outcome that perhaps was different than there otherwise would have been if this had been a trial that didn't rely so much on translation and interpreting? And to my great surprise, it turned out that no, this was not a deciding issue in any but one trial. And in this case, somebody who had pled guilty, I'm thinking of his name, I probably won't remember it, but anyway, he'd pled guilty, and he came back and was, no. Anyway, he was in an appeals situation, so he couldn't have pled guilty. He must have, he testified, he got I don't know, some kind of a sentence, and then he came back and it was the appeal for the sentence. And the interpreter in the booth, I'm sorry, because I want to do this as accurately as I can, but I just want to remember it right. So there was something along the lines that he was saying that another accused, he was complaining about the length of his sentence, that's right. And he said another accused was responsible for many more lives lost than I was. I was responsible for, I don't know, 3,000 lives lost, and she was responsible for many more thousands. So I shouldn't have a sentence any longer than her, something along those lines. And the interpreter in the booth, following the grammatical structure of the sentence, said, I was responsible for only that many lives lost. And so then there was a complaint that that was prejudicial, and that it wasn't what was said, and that it would make it sound like that he thought that that number of lives was inconsequential and that he shouldn't be given his sentence. And so they reduced the sentence that he was given based on that complaint. But that's the only one. There were some complaints made about translation, but interestingly, not about what you suggested about the interpreters being traumatized and so forth, but about procedural issues, because the translation unit was a terrible bottleneck. You had this moment for each trial where just before it was about to begin, as I described, the prosecution would make a presentation of what they were going to prosecute in the course of the trial. And at that moment, they had to disclose, there's this thing called disclosure in trials. They had to disclose to the defense all the documents they'd be tendering as evidence in translation. And if they were going to tender a lot of evidence, that was thousands of pages that had to be ready for that day to disclose to the defense. And if you had 3 or 4 trials in disclosure at a similar time, our translation unit was just out of control. It was absolutely devastating to have to meet all these deadlines. And one of the defendants in one of the Kosovo-Serbian trials, and I don't remember his name, but he complained that he couldn't get the documents that he needed at the moment he needed them, and that this was prejudicial to his case. But that was not seen as a deciding factor in his sentencing. So it was far less key to the outcomes of the trials than I was surprised. I don't know if that answered. Oh, and the other thing is that, yes, interpreters got very emotional in the course of the trial, but generally when they got emotional, everybody was emotional. There was a description of one of the really awful moments in a courtroom where someone came out of the courtroom early in the work of the tribunal, so people weren't sort of routinized as much as they got later. And they said today everybody was crying in the courtroom, the witness, the judges, all the staff, everybody was crying. Yes?
Can you tell me something about the translation unit? as per se, you had translators, you had revisers, you had linguistic advisors. What was the process of translating one document, for example?
The process was that we had an administrative unit, and they would receive documents from the defense and the prosecution. We worked for both of them. And then they would decide, based on all these issues like disclosure and schedules, how urgent any one document was. And they'd come up, and we had trays, as I said, on the side of the room, and there'd be the most urgent, the less urgent, the least urgent, and there'd be deadlines written on them for when they needed to get these things translated first by the translator, and they'd bring them up and distribute them among the 35 translators. And when there was a huge push, they'd send things out of house to the people working for us out of house. The people working for us out of house, almost all of them had worked at the tribunal for a period of time, so they were already trained to the kind of translation we were doing, which is very specific kind of accuracy that we were requiring of our translators. And then the translator would translate it and maybe bring it back down to the administrators or bring it, I think they did, and then the administrators would bring it up to the revisers room and put it into our trays, and we'd revise them, and then we'd submit them, and they'd go back into whoever the body was that was requiring.
So you revised the document, then it goes back to the translator?
I'd take it back to the translator, and they'd enter the changes that I suggested, and then it would go down to administration, and it would go back to whoever the ordering party had been. And yeah, I mean, it's an administration. We only had 4 or 5 administrators in the administrative office, and they handled all of that. And of course, they were working with the parties all the time and negotiating.
To translators, like this translator is like the top tier, we don't need to revise. His documents go directly.
Well, we had revisors. We had people of P4 status within the translation unit. P4 was, as I said, the interpreters were P4, but there were also translators who were P4 who could be either a translator or a reviser. And then if they had that status, they didn't have to be revised. But then sometimes if they were ticklish texts and stuff, we preferred to have them revised, and it was, we would revise them. There was a certain amount of sort of just judgment calls on that basis. But in terms of whether we had linguists, we had a service that was doing a terminological service that was helping us with terminology and dealing with trade-offs type issues, but we couldn't use trade-offs very much because most of our documents were PDFs. They were images, and so they couldn't put them through a trade-off system. They weren't doc files. Did you have a question?
Yeah, so this touches already a question. I was wondering to what extent you think translation technology would be helpful in that whole context, also maybe for interpretation.
Well, obviously, when we started out in '98, we didn't even have Google in the office because they were concerned that if we were connected into the network, that would be a security vulnerable place that we could be broken into by security experts. So when I started, I would make a list of all the things that I wanted to research, and I was staying in someone's apartment over the summer, and I'd go back to the apartment and look things up in the evening on Google because I couldn't do it at work. Then they introduced one computer in each room that had internet access, and the different translators in that room could go and do research on it. And then ultimately, by the time I came back in 2005, everybody had internet access, and they had done whatever they had done to keep that safe. But anyway, I don't know if that really responds.
Yeah, so do you think there's or what you think is one fully automatizes, for instance, this interpretation process? So you can see that we had demonstrations here where people speak and it's simultaneously translated and so on. And maybe an interpreter would just take the role of supervising.
Yeah, I don't know enough about that kind of interpreting and mechanization to know how well that would do. I think that the concern is the emotional end of things that now interpreters learned over the years, and this goes to the question that we were asked about interpreters and emotional traumatic testimony, to hold back from a lot of emotional involvement in the testimony. But I did have a colleague working from the Albanian who said that that the next day in the news he would read the quotes that he'd been the most emotional about. That communicates itself so powerfully to people listening that they would write those down because they were affected by his emotions. So, but I know these extremely professional interpreters. One of them worked there 16 years. You can imagine. I mean, so she, or some of them even longer, they developed ways of working through. And they would say, if they had to say something, you know, to request slowing down or a moment or something, or there were always two of them in the booth, and so they could ask somebody to take over if they were struggling with something. And they were from the region, so obviously they were not indifferent to the, I mean, nobody could be indifferent, but it was a very personal thing for a lot of them, hearing the things that were going on. But, and there was there were several instances, which always happens in interpreting and in this particular, but only a few. If you think of the 10,800 trial sessions, I think there were 5 instances where a translator forgot that their microphone had not been turned off. And one of them, at one point, a good friend of mine said, "Oh, he is so full of shit." and so this then went into, you know, consultation, and then she was taken off that trial and put on a different trial and someone else. But there's always, I mean, people are people, they're human. But what was very interesting, the woman who was the head of interpreting told me on that example and the other 4 that happened, that interestingly, it never happened that an interpreter would say that of someone from a different ethnic group. It was always from their own ethnic group. So if it was a Serbian interpreter commenting on something a Serb said in the courtroom, they would only do that, but they would never cross ethnic lines and criticize someone from a different, which was just an internal automatic filter. It's just so interesting that it goes that deeply that they would, but that's the kind of thing that I can't quite, I have to say, I can't imagine it mechanized, the interpreting. The translating, sure. I mean, we saw lots of, well, I showed you the terminology. That terminology could have been used to build a database like Trade-off based on the equipment that we had, but we didn't. We just had the consultation. You could go into this. It was on every computer, and you could check terms, and I still use it for military things. Anybody else off-site? Okay. Well, hello to all of you who are out there. I'm happy to, and if any of you are working on projects where this is of some relevance, please feel free to contact me through either Brian Baer or Joanna Huss. I'm happy to talk to people going forward if I can be of help to you.
Well, thank you so much. This is absolutely